From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm really pleased to have you here at our Founders Day concert. Today, happens to be the 150th birthday of our founder, Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, who founded the concert series in 1925 when the hall was opened, the auditorium was opened. So we're celebrating her birthday with one of the things that she held most dear, which is new music and supporting the music of living composers. So I'm very pleased to have with me tonight composer George Lewis, I should say composer, musicologist, performer, many, many other hats that he wears as well, and conductor of the ensemble tonight, Ensemble Dal Niente, Michael Lewanski. They're both really doing great work today. I was just kind of flabbergasted at the rehearsals, so you're in for a great treat. One thing I'd like to say before we get started is that in addition to Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge and her own contributions, it left an indelible impression upon other future donors. And one of those donors was Leonora Jackson McKim, who also put together a commissioning fund that allowed the new commission of George Lewis's work that we're going to hear tonight. So we're very pleased that that legacy is being continued in this way. So the music that you will hear tonight is by George Lewis and Georg Friedrich Haas. So I guess you could say that the music is going to be Georgius.
Or Georgus.
or Georgus, I'm not sure. If you're into Socratic, or Gorgias. That was a bad.
That was really, that was great.
So I thought we would kind of go through this in the program order, because Michael is going to actually leave us a little bit later so that he can go work with some of the musicians. But starting with the new work, it's called The Mangle of Practice.
Yes.
And I wanted to know what's in a name and how did this piece come about?
Well, in a way, it expresses my interest, first of all, in cybernetics. The term comes from an essay by the sociologist of science, Andrew Pickering. And I was on a panel, sort of a 2-week residency with him at the University of Oxford. It brought together, scientists. I think I was wearing my musicology hat for that one, so I was a musicologist rather than a composer. So they had geographers, and geography is really kind of the new comparative literature. I mean, you can do almost anything. It's incredible, the scope of what geographers are doing now. It's not like the old geography that you took in school. It's a sort of extraordinary scholarship they're doing, political scholarship. So political scientists, sociologists, theorists, and so on. And Andrew Pickering wrote a well-known book also called The Cybernetic Brain, and so I spend a lot of time working on computer music, and a lot of it is influenced by the social aesthetics that emerged by the cybernetic influenced young composers in the late 70s. So The Mangle of Practice is an essay of his from the 90s. It's about agency, and it's about how indeterminacy of interaction and practice, so that practice becomes something that once we engage in it, it inevitably changes us and changes the environment. We tend to think of things like people, let's say in improvised music or improvisation studies, people talk about constraints, constraints being this thing that, it's like a jail you go into, and once you're there, you know what the walls look like, and you can touch them as, here, this far and no further. Well, Pickering, he's saying that constraints are pretty much interactively, the implication of his work is that constraints are interactively achieved by the same people to whom they're subject. So all this is expressed by the notion of the mangle. Now the mangle, Pickering is British, right? So the mangle, I don't know if you know the English version of the Mangle, which we would call the ringer. I was trying to talk to some young people, and I realized they didn't know what a ringer was, you know. You know, and we had one, you had to crank it, and you put the clothes through, and it made them flat, and it squeezed out all the water, you know. So that's their sense of the Mangle, something that somehow really, and I'm thinking, I'm using it in a much more poetic way, as somehow looking for sources of noise, looking for mangling of traditions, looking for points of intersection that produce noise and unusual artifacts, unpredictable artifacts.
Does that practice component come into play with the actual performative aspect? Is that something that we should also be listening for?
Well, it's meant to kind of depict that or embody that. I mean, I think of agency, he thinks of agency as performative. In other words, you have to do agency. You don't, it doesn't inhere in you. You get it through interaction, through activity. And so my sort of take on that is that it becomes improvisative. That is to say that because it's indeterminate, you have to be ready for anything. You have to be aware, alert, and ready to take on potentially foreign ideas or influences, and you have to improvise the listening as well as the performance part. And put it another way, listening is performative or improvisative as well. So that's funny in a piece for which there's actually no improvisation in the piece, but the idea is that you can still talk about these ideas and you can still express them.
Sure. Maybe we'll come back later if we have some time to talk a bit more about the improvisative types of music that you do in other realms as well. But maybe we could look at the relationship that you have with Dal Niente and how that came about with our second piece, which is called Assemblage, or I believe as they say in French, Assemblage, because it's such a great piece. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Michael? I mean, you were, you know,
well, I guess
conducted the premiere, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great piece. I think, yeah, I mean, you're talking about sort of improvisative listening. I guess a thing that I was struck by actually reading your program note just now about the piece. Can I see the program note real quick? So I mean, like when we did the premiere, I think basically a year ago, this time last year at the Bowling Green New Music Festival, Bowling Green. Bowling Green State in Ohio is this, in this tiny town, and they have this university that just devotes a ton of resources to this completely awesome new music festival. And they brought in my Ensemble Dal Niente and myself and George, and he wrote this awesome piece for us last year, and I mean, just incredibly grateful to them for making it happen. But sort of studying the score, before we performed it the first time, and then we performed it since a few more times. The thing that I really notice about it is that it has these kind of recurring grooves or themes. I mean, really both. It has some tempos that recur, and it has some thematic material. And so I found myself sort of searching for ways of listening to it and sort of relating it to like developmental things that composers often do. And so when I read your program note, I was surprised by what you said at the end. You say something like, where is it? You say that I encourage listeners to catch the bus and go along for the ride, unburdened by the expectation of teleologies or global form. And here I had been trying to look for a global form for the past year, so shame on me. But,
you are released. Go you forth.
Yeah, but no, I guess. But in all seriousness, though, I think my question is that as listeners, I think we often, so much of our listening experience in this country, let's say, has to do with a form-based listening somehow. Maybe like we hear pop songs on the radio that have a repeating chorus or something like that, or we hear a Beethoven symphony or whatever. And so for whatever reason, my ear, when I hear something like that, I want to make it a form. And here you are talking about forgive me, I can't pronounce it. A different kind of listening.
Improvisative,
Yeah.
Yeah,
a different kind of listening experience. So can you speak to somehow the difference between form as developmental and the kind of and what you're doing in this piece?
Yeah, I've been influenced by, there's a certain debate going on in the philosophy of music, and I'd say the major protagonists are Peter Keavy on the one hand and Gerald Levinson on the other. And this idea about the pleasures that come from global form and the sort of almost necessity of it, talking about, let's say, early 19th century music as being the apotheosis of that. And what happens afterwards? I mean, you don't really find global form in Wagner, for example. So the thing is that, when you read some of the, like say, Cosima Wagner's diaries and others, you get the sense that what he was really doing was he was improvising at the piano between leitmotifs and then writing it down. So it's a very different model of how to think about form, but it's very supple, and that's what accounts for, I think, part of what I sense when I listen to something like, I don't know, Siegfried or something. But this debate concerns, the other side of the debate, the Levinson debate, concerns what he's calling concatenationism, which is to say that we don't need global form. In fact, we rarely experience it. And there are lots of, we said, put things together on the spot from what we have available in terms of experience, and as we concatenate them. So we might decide, and it's a kind of philosophy that lends itself to kind of reader response ideas. It involves the audience. The audience is just as capable of putting these things together as I am as the composer, and I can't sort of tell people, well, here's the roadmap you have to follow, and here's how you have to listen. In fact, every one of you is going to have a different listening experience and is going to put together a different concatenation of what they're hearing. So what happens in the piece is, I'm not really afraid of jump cuts or, having someone suddenly starts shouting for no reason or no reason you can discern or things of that sort. Sort of the, the idea being that there's a lot of quick reversals in the music, and the assemblage, you might want to call it a montage in some ways, but the term assemblage, something that Dubuffet made for some of his early sculptures. And I'm drawing my work from the people that I knew the best, which were the African-American assemblage artists, starting with Noah Purifoy. If you look on the web, you'll see these incredible, he made like acres and acres of sculptures in Joshua Tree, California, in the desert. And he's got 25-foot mounds of, toilet fixtures. It's like Duchamp times 50. Or he's got another one with just tires, or he's got another one with just television sets or computers. And the way they make them up, it's very open-ended, but it also has the sense of the improvisative sense without actually itself being improvised in some way. Or you could say, if you're thinking about it from a Cagean dimension, maybe it's improvisation with respect to composition rather than with respect to performance. So that what you guys are playing, and this is why you can't find the global form, is because I tend to think in a concatenationist way, also with the new piece. And so that allows me to work in a modular way that allows a sense of ongoing surprise, a sense of ongoing, and so the development comes from accretion of a feeling of, I don't know, I don't mind if people feel a little insecure. If I see them kind of putting back their feet and taking off their shoes, I get a little nervous. So, so I try to make it so that doesn't happen. And so people have to be on their toes in case a giant bug comes flying in or something.
One thing I just maybe could follow up on that with is that there are also different points of view that come with, you have a very different feeling about the piece, knowing the piece in advance and playing it, so that memory plays a quite integral role, I would imagine, in either constructing a form or a way to deal with the piece versus, say, audience members tonight who might be hearing the work for the first time, or your listeners who are listening to a recorded version and have access to it many different times. How does that play into this, into how those different formal constructions come into play? That's a question for anybody.
Well, okay, I'll try to deal with that. What I try to do is I try to subvert memory. That might be something that a lot of contemporary music does. What you have I'm hoping that at the end of it, you have a strong sort of set of neurons firing in a certain way, but you might not be able to say what that way is. There might be a tune or two, but you won't be able to find it. And then, it's going to be, you won't be going out humming. You might be more like buzzing, or, or trembling. I don't know. I mean, something is a very physical sense of memory that's trying to be evoked here. And this is what Dal Niente brings out. Now, last year, you guys did it great last year, but this year, the rehearsal, this is one of the greatest ensembles in the country, if not the world, I'm telling you. And so the thing is that when I listen to this, they're asking me what I think, and I'm just like, I feel like an idiot because I was totally riveted. I'm looking for some critical thing to say. Percussion is, I don't know, something, fall back on some cliche about drums. I mean, no, it was extraordinary, and they're doing extraordinary work tonight, and thank you for, taking this on. It's not an easy thing to do. It lasts about, 15 minutes, and, there's some pleasant bits, don't worry.
So actually, I mean, I have a question. You're talking about wanting to subvert memory. Yeah, and that's such an interesting question. So what immediately then occurs to me is how does that relate to style? Which is to say that, I feel like, again, forgive me for being such a sort of classical conductor and only knowing Mozart, but you get the sense that you listen to the Viennese classics or even a lot of 19th century music, and you get a sense that the composer is speaking in a style that the audience is sharing. And actually, I mean, and I think if maybe this is an erroneous assertion, but one might say the same thing for certain histories of jazz, certain parts of the history of jazz. A shared style that the audience understands and the performers are engaging in. And it does seem to me also that contemporary music often does subvert or reinvent style all the time. In fact, Matthias Spalinger, who we were talking about just earlier today, does that sort of thing. And so if you're trying to subvert memory, then how do you engage style and how do you think about it? And yeah, I mean, what is the style of this piece, maybe is my question.
Well, it's funny. One of my great mentors was Muhal Richard Abrams, and I just remember him saying, style is to be avoided. And I was wondering, I keep coming back to that because of maybe it's not just style, but even genre that has to be taken very carefully, because people sometimes feel that if they can pinpoint the style, then they can stop listening because they know it's going to happen. Now, or they can pinpoint the genre and they say, oh, that's this, and we don't have to worry about it. And so one way to approach that in sort of a postmodern vein was to smash a lot of styles together that are all sort of received and known. I find myself thinking that rather than do that, I'm sort of filtering a lot of what I'm hearing, like you said, Second Viennese, whatever comes in the door, through me, but whatever comes out has to reflect who I am internally. And so that would be a posteriori notion of what style is. I would have my own style, which I'm hoping to avoid as well. Now, and so you have to, once you see it, you have to sort of kill it. Because it could sort of like a bug or something again, bad bug. Sorry about that. If you like bugs, sorry, biologist, But the other side of it is that just talking about that, that jazz point, or for that matter, early, certainly Second Viennese or even, First Viennese school. When it first happens, people are pretty baffled by it. I mean, that's really how it worked. I mean, even like all those stories about Charlie Parker, and they're playing their music, and the other musicians who come from the old ways couldn't even figure out when the thing started and when it stopped and why. So, and these were pretty experienced people. It wasn't just a lay audience. So you can sort of say that maybe at the beginning of something, there's no such thing as this group that come together to celebrate something that they know. Maybe that comes later. And at the point that comes, that is wonderful. I mean, there's some recordings I've listened to like probably 50,000 times, literally, that I've grown up with and will probably die with. I thought it wouldn't be bad if I found that I was on a plane that was going down, I'd probably put on, I don't know, a late Coltrane piece or something. Let's go out with that. But beyond that, I guess for me, the idea is that what I mean by subverting memory, and I think that's not uncommon in new music, some of it is kind of hard to remember the details, but you remember the outlines, and you make your own version. It reflects the explorations that listeners and musicians go through in creating their own understandings of what a piece is about. So what it ultimately does, and maybe this is going a little bit further than what your question was, or your thought was, my feeling is that listening to new music is about change. It's about, and that's why it's still kind of dangerous, you know. Like, you go out of the concert tonight, you listen to Georg's piece or my piece, and maybe you say, wow, that really was different. Wonder what else could be different around here. And that's the danger point right there. That's when people say, well, wait a minute now. You know, we don't want anything to be different. We're happy with what's happening now. And what were you just doing? Oh, I was listening to that guy, George Lewis. Well, get him out of here. You know? So I think that, if we lose that music, there are going to be a lot of people who are very disappointed because that potential for change is no longer being symbolized or asserted, and that tends to make people very depressed when they don't feel that things can change.
I wish that I could high-five you right now. That's just, that's great. That's like, that kind of like Adorno-esque kind of notion that, like, you know, I don't know, or at least the assumption that things are changeable. You know, I find myself sort of coming back to that also in new music. Gosh, so many questions. Can I ask you about, I guess, so in new music versus, I feel like in improvisation you have thoughts about the sort of social implications of improvisation and its social function. In new music, I wonder if you could elucidate your opinion about social function in improvisation, and then maybe contrast that with whatever social function you might think that, I mean, maybe you just did actually, new music has, because this is certainly a thing that I struggle with myself. So like the musicians on the stage, how do they, you know, what should or does their interaction feel like?
I guess the first thing I'm trying to parse for myself is I'm not able to really draw a bright line between improvisation and new music, because that's more of a methodological contrast, if any. And it's not even that much of a methodological contrast, because you find a lot of people working with aspects of improvisation or indeterminacy or some variation of, like all those people who are influenced by Christian Wolff, like me or John Zorn or people like this. Or people like Anthony Braxton who combine these things in very unique ways. You know, Nicole Mitchell. I mean, there's so many. So but if you're talking about improvisation, let me sort of go a little bit off to the side of what you're talking about. I got interested in thinking about the nature of improvisation because I read this book by Irving Goffman. I don't know, this sociologist, Canadian sociologist. He wrote a book, published it around in the 50s. I think it's called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. Now that's an amazing book, and I signed it for a class, and some student complained, and I said, look, the reality is there are 3 generations of people in this room who had this book assigned to them in their class. There's someone right over there. He assigned it to me. I'm assigning it to you. So there you go. So the thing is about this book is that it takes a kind of a dramaturgical metaphor for everyday social interaction. They're interested in the everyday things people do, like ethnomethodological stuff, behavior and lines, or he even has sections on how people accompany each other, and this sort of embedded social cues, a lot of which are just sonic. People hear the intention in the sound. The sound carries carries the information about goals, intentions, plans, and that's what we want to remember when we improvise, is that whether we're improvising music or whether we're improvising some other activity, like finding out that the route you wanted to take to get here is blocked, and the GPS finds a new route for you, or you find your own route. These are all moments of just everyday improvisation. So, and there's a lot of signaling that takes place, verbal, nonverbal, gestural, that underlies a lot of those processes. So he never mentions improvisation in the book, but I began to see this was all about improvisation. This is what I started to experience improvisation through the book. Now, that's part one. Part two is, around about 78, I started to think about, well, wow, what if we could make a computer to do that? And I've been doing that now for about 30 years. So the computers have gotten better. They kind of play the piano, or they do these virtual orchestras. They debut as a piano soloist with the American Composers Orchestra at Carnegie Hall. Said, wow, they're playing, they're improvising music, and the orchestra's playing its part, and the computer is just listening and playing along. Doing quite well, actually. But the thing is, a lot of the same processes are in play, which are, at a certain point, it's a kind of emotional transduction that's taking place, where things that you play or that the computer is listening to in the environment come back to you because of the input representation and the way the output is coupled to that. They come back to you in some form that tends to reflect what happened going in. And then to make things a little bit more complicated, what you need to make these things really work is that the computer has to do things that you didn't anticipate and that it made up by itself without your knowledge or consent. So that it just presents things to you that you have to deal with. And that's the moment where we sense difference and agency, and the play of the dance of agency that Pickering talks about comes out of those moments. So these are the two elements that cause me to think about social function or social interaction, because when you have to think about interacting with a computer, and you realize that if it's really good, it's not so different. And that's what a lot of the AI people, I think, are getting around to thinking about when they're starting to now, improvisation has had what do they call it, a bad rap in like classical music, and a lot of the researchers who were influenced by that bad rap didn't realize until, let's say, the 90s, AI researchers didn't realize that what they were really studying was improvisation. And they're getting to the stage now where they can call the machines they make improvisers, like the one that went to Mars. That's my model of an improvising machine I'd like to work on.
Well, maybe to follow up on that, you have this piece, I think it's called the Interactive Trio.
Oh, yeah.
It's for two pianos and trombone.
Mm-hmm.
And I've just seen this on Vimeo, and
Oh, boy.
And the one piano is not, there's not a human playing it, but this is where you have, it's a great example of where the agency is earned by presumably the improvising program, or is that?
Yes, that's right.
And then, but it just from viewing it from an outsider's view, not knowing how you produced that, it was entirely convincing. And I guess one of the things that I'm curious about with that process is how do you, avoiding these issues of rules, how do you still manage from a programming standpoint to make something that doesn't become so impossible to work with that that the human performer isn't able to interact in a realistic way, because it felt so realistic. I don't know that that's a very clear question, but.
Well, it was a good performance. I'm glad that it made it to the internet or whatever, because, sometimes they're not so good.
Sure.
Like us. So some days it's a little dense, and it makes a couple of bonehead moves, and I've been able over the years to reduce the amount of bonehead action by these computers, but I haven't quite eliminated it because I haven't quite eliminated it myself. And so, but I've gotten to the stage now where I feel that we're faced with the same kinds of issues of mutual intelligibility, for example, which is a core issue for us as human beings. So when you're talking about these kinds of things, it's not so much a matter of getting things to work or creating a smooth performance or things of that sort, although that might be important for certain kinds of social dealings. Like, we don't want our everyday conversations at work or something to devolve into shouting matches. We don't really want that, so we try to avoid those kinds of things. But quite often, those are the same kinds of issues that human beings face in improvising music or going about their daily lives, are the kinds of issues that I try to explore in the computer music. And when the computer and the humans are faced with the same kinds of tasks, although they might construct them differently and they might have different processes for getting to a certain space, at the moment of performance, signaling through sound, it really doesn't matter who is the computer and who isn't.
So the uncontrolled thing might be an opportunity for a different interaction that you weren't expecting and could therefore be a great musical moment or something like that?
Well, that's why I like it to be open-ended. I mean, I want the computer to play differently with different people, which means it has to have a good sense of a good sort of input analysis, sort of input representation scheme. And once that happens, you have to have something that will be able to reflect that in the output. But then the other thing, as I said before, the other part of it is that you need something that, if you stop playing, my machines say, oh, I have a solo now. And they just go on by themselves as if you weren't there. And if you come back, it says, oh, there's someone here. Well, let's pay attention, if I want. But those moments when they don't pay attention, you're a human being, you feel that, right? You think, well, wow, it's like, it's not listening in quite the same way, or it found that interesting in what I did, but not that. And so those are the kind of things that we sense as, we do it all the time. We sense it in our daily lives. I mean, the extent to which we receive important signals through our ears, just through sound, being able to interpret the sounds of our loved ones. We come home and someone says, so how was your day? And you say, okay. Well, if you're reading that, you think, oh, it's okay.
Well, maybe we can divert for a moment to talk about the other piece on the program. Michael, you want to just tell us a little bit about the Haus?
Yeah, sure. I just want to listen to George though. Like, you just.
I want to hear about Haus. Let's hear about Haus, man. I want to hear you do this.
Yeah, no, I'll talk. Well, and I'll invite your comments on what I say, because I feel like actually the question of like a teleological approach to form actually is part of what Haus is all about. Certainly in this piece. So I would say okay. Few things about this piece. It's really long. That's an important thing to know. Sort of Haas working in this kind of, he's Austrian, right? This kind of Austro-Germanic tradition of Bruckner, Mahler, things taking a long time to develop. I think that, and that's one important, maybe the biggest picture important detail. And then two other important details are that there's two sections that happen entirely in the dark, and they happen for different compositional reasons. And that's thing number two. Thing number three is this: there's an explicit opposition set up by Haas between two different tuning systems. One is the so-called equal temperament, which is the way that we tune our pianos. It's and the way that I read equal temperament is really equal temperament is a product of the Enlightenment impulse to dominate nature. And so you divide the octave into 12 equidistant half steps, which, is definitely not a thing that God intended. God's music sounds like the harmonic series, which is sort of pure intervals that sound very beautiful. So Haas, and we invent pianos, and so we can have equal temperament, so we can play in all 24 keys. And equal temperament became a thing throughout the 19th century, and now that's just the temperament that everyone plays in. Haas pits this against so-called just intonation, which is an intonation system based on the harmonic series, which, like I said, is this kind of very beautiful, very pure sonorities. And so there are these two different types of musical materials that he has, and at least nominally, he posits this also as a political metaphor, because he wrote this piece after the 1999 elections in Austria, in which a kind of like fascistic, ultra right-wing political party won a lot of votes. And so Haas is interested in so he essentially uses equal temperament to, if you're doing the allegory, you say equal temperament is fascism, and just intonation is progress, or is liberalism, or some sort of like notion that humans can get better. And he keeps juxtaposing these two types of tuning systems, and the end of the piece, one keeps becoming the other, and it happens cyclically, such that he seems to be suggesting that in fact no progress is possible. So the way in which I find it, the question of a teleological form, what I find really interesting is this: is after the second section in the dark, it seems like Haas doesn't know how to end the piece. I mean, in a sense, he sort of gives up on the notion that he can have a form that will take you somewhere. And so what you have is you have these big blocks of sonority descending and getting faster and faster and faster and not actually getting anywhere. And then from the quickness emerges more slow music, and it gets faster and faster and faster, until it's, really fast. And then more slow music emerges, and it gets faster and faster. And it just stops all of a sudden. And it's the end of the piece. And that's the same as, he's saying it could really just go on forever. And in fact, it will go on forever. It seems to be the suggestion, but it seems to me, compositionally speaking, that it's almost like he's throwing his hands in the air and saying, there is no more form. I can't do anything with form. I can't get anywhere with this. And so the piece is called In Vain, which is not subtle. I don't know. What do you think about any of that? Is that crazy?
I didn't know it was based on Jörg Haider, a critique of Jörg Haider. I had no idea. Well, that's interesting. It's funny because, there's a lot of repetition in the Haas piece. Okay, and then, repetition is one of these. There's a sort of interesting essay by a guy named James Sneed. It's called Repetition as a Figure in Black Culture or something like that. And, a number of us have used this essay a lot in our scholarly work, and it goes into critiques of fear of repetition in the works of people like Hegel, and the idea that certain kinds of cyclical people who think in cyclical ways, to which he sort of assigns that to the African sphere, and he says, well, this is not how diurnal rhythms and all that. He's opposed to all that. We want to look at these sort of linear ideas about progress, and my take on this comes from. My sort of gloss on this comes from the myth of Sisyphus, which is one of those scary myths about in Greek, where you got the stone, you push it up and it goes back down, and you push it up and it goes back down. He's condemned to repeat this action through eternity, and that's real hell. That's real hell until Nietzsche comes along. and with the eternal recurrence, which the demon comes and says, well, you're sort of condemned to repeat this thing over and over and over again for your whole life. And Nietzsche says, well, would you curse the demon that came to your life and told you that? And he says, well, actually, I would say you are a god, and I've never heard anything so divine. And so there's what I'm hearing, what you said was a kind of thesis, antithesis, synthesis notion that Haas is coming up with, setting up these antinomies. No, it's like it's I with improvisative. That's easy for me because I made it because I made it myself. But these oppositions, right? And so setting those up and looking for, well, what you said, there is no resolution. So we have to continue to exist and face the possibility that any resolution is going to be temporary, contingent, and is going to require a repetition of vigilance. So it is on that view, it is a very politically charged piece, and I appreciate the fact that he, the way he wrote it in opposition to that situation.
We might take, you might need to go in just a few minutes, Michael. Maybe if there's a question for Michael, what we'll do is we'll talk just a little bit more with Mr. Lewis about his upcoming projects, but Michael has to go work with some of the musicians. So if anybody has a question for him, and just if you could wait for the microphone, Jay will bring it.
Thanks. Could you tell us, it's probably in the program notes, which I haven't read, but what are the two different reasons that one of these pieces is in the dark? You said there were two different reasons?
Yes. Well, so I would say that the first dark section happens maybe 5 minutes into the piece, and it's the way that it feels to me, and the way that I read it, is that he has all this swirling figuration at the beginning, and you can feel him struggling with the material as a composer, that he's somehow dissatisfied with this kind of equal-tempered world that he lives in. And so, I mean, I feel like you feel composers struggling all the time with their materials, and it's a very interesting thing as a performer to sort of feel how that manifests itself in the composition. And it feels like a very unique solution to the problem of struggling with one's musical materials. What he says is, I'm going to burn the thing to the ground. We're going to put the whole thing in the dark. We're going to start over. And then what you have in the first dark section is just an attempt to reconsider what music might be, where you have a low trombone note for a while, and you think about that. And then you have a low horn note for a while, and you think about that. And from there, he sort of arrives at this, the natural harmonic series, just intonation. So having emerged, the music feels like it's purged itself through this process. And what happens as the piece winds on is different kinds of harmonic series kind of end up clashing because they have some of the same notes, but they're tuned slightly differently as a result of the ratios. And so you end up with some of the same intervals that he had actually started with in the equal tempered opening. And so it feels like the second dark section is a result of sort of problems inherent in the solution. So the second dark section is kind of a battle, if you like. It's an explicit battle between kind of equal temperament and the harmonic series. And unfortunately, the winner is kind of a foregone conclusion. So I think that it's a very interesting. Honestly, the first time I heard that, so I heard the piece first in the recording by Klangform Wien from maybe 2004, and it's a wonderful recording. And I didn't realize that actually any of it happened in the dark because I just heard the recording. And when I first heard that part of it happened in the dark, frankly, I thought it was going to be a really cheap trick, but it is not. It's a very sort of astute kind of structural compositional move on his part, and he uses it, I think, very effectively. So, does that answer your question?
I had a follow-up, but I didn't.
We'll just do one more question just from a. Okay.
Michael, thank you for staying one more
Sure,
minute.
my pleasure.
Since there's both a composer and a conductor of new experimental and improvisatory music on the stage, I wanted to ask this. Michael, your sibling organization, the International Contemporary Ensemble, has and this is a question about computer music, so think about that, each of you, in the answer. The ICE has been doing works in which the conductor, and I'm not going to mention names, but the conductor does not necessarily have a macro view of the complete piece. The conductor is more of an instrument of the composer, and it's the composer at the sound design console who's the only one going into the duration of the piece that knows what's going on. And I wanted to ask, do you have an opinion as to whether, do each of you have an opinion as to whether the conductor should have a macro view of the piece for the duration, or do you feel that with this collapse of hierarchies that it's no longer important for the conductor to have this oversight view, this macro view?
That's a good question. I'm going to say something that might seem completely insane coming from someone like me. I mean, it sounds like I'm going to put myself out of work by saying this, but I think the historical role of the conductor, the role of the conductor is a relic of the 19th century, in my opinion, which is to say that I think that when you look at, it feels like the century that produced the sort of the heroic Beethoven and the Wagner that everyone kind of worshipped when he sort of sat on stage for portrait concerts, produced the conductor, who is the channeling, the person in touch with the divine composer, who's channeling the music through his physical gestures. I find that notion just hopelessly flawed, frankly, and isn't that crazy? I mean, I'm saying that I'm in a sense like I feel very unnecessary sometimes, which is to say I'm not unnecessary. What I try to do is I try to be very aware of what my role is, which is to say, especially in new music, I feel my role is primarily facilitative, which is to say I'm trying to help my very intelligent musicians do their best work by providing them with an extra set of ears and also being a traffic cop when I need to be. And also it's true, I mean, often the role of the conductor will go along with a sort of a big picture artistic vision, simply because, what we have to do is we have to look at a lot of scores. And, I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of scores in my lifetime, and so, hopefully I rubbed a few brain cells together, and developed some opinions, but that's not a necessity, I think.
But when you play a piece in which you had not heard the computer design aspect
Would
before the performance?
I guess I wouldn't want to rule out doing that. I'd want to know why. So if it was a specific thing that a composer was going to insist on, that the conductor remain in the dark about some aspect of the piece, I'm for the most part going to defer to the composer in that situation, but I'd want to know why. And honestly, because like so many times, just having a conductor is really practical. Like I can, what I can do is I can listen and say, hey, that's too loud and that's too soft and that was out of tune and too fast, too slow. I certainly don't object to the notion of a changing role of the conductor kind of going forward, and I certainly do not buy the notion that conductors are anything other than, just dudes, or women, I mean, like just people, and the way that our culture, unfortunately, U.S. culture, I think fetishizes conductors is really deeply unhealthy, in my opinion. So.
On that note, just because we're running out of time, I'll let Michael go.
Thanks, y'all.
Yeah, but
I'll stay here.
thanks. We'll see you in a bit. And we will take a few questions for George Lewis, but first I wanted him to tell us just a little bit about some of his upcoming projects, in particular the operatic project.
Well, it was kind of interesting you mentioned ICE, because that's the ensemble that's going to be performing this opera I'm currently struggling with. It's called Afterward. It's going to premiere at there are going to be several premieres. There's going to be a preview and at the performance space in Brooklyn and New York. That's going to be in May of next year. And then there'll be another preview at the Ostravadates Festival in the Czech Republic. That's going to be sometime in August. And then October, mid-October, we're going to do the premiere of 2 acts is all I think I can get together between now and then. Especially since I'm writing the libretto as well. So I'll tell you a bit about that. The premiere will take place at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and it's sponsored in part by the Gray Center for Arts and Inquiry at the University of Chicago there, and we've gotten some other funding that will help us out in different ways. In 2008, I published a book called A Power Stronger Than Itself, the AACM in American Experimental Music. And I always make jokes about this book. It's almost 700 pages. It's it's sort of long-winded. It's a long-winded academic book, and and so on. But it has a lot of interesting sort of voices in it. And the last chapter of the book, I interviewed about 100 people for this book, but it's primarily a historical book and not an ethnographic book, really. Although there's some ethnographic techniques, and it's about this group called the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians that I've been a part of since 1971, African American Experimental Music Collective. It had an enormous impact on, on contemporary music and new music in the U.S. and abroad. I mean, it's a very important organization. So the book, actually, it's very funny. I mean, a lot of people read this thing, and what I like about it is that some of the musicians who were part of this overall scene are still around, and they look at I got a wonderful text message from somebody. It's a picture of him riding the train reading this book. Now, this book weighs about 5 pounds. So I thought, what did he have to leave behind in order to bring this book? So I was pretty happy about that. Now, the thing is that the last chapter of the book, I synthesized a lot of the interviews into a virtual conversation with people living and dead about aspirations. People had musicians, composers, experimentalists, computer artists, people who made kinetic sculptures, people who made performance art. All these people were involved in the AACM. And so it was all about looking at their aspirations about their own work, their aspirations about changes in the world society, all these kinds of, their aesthetic stances, all of these things are sort of important in terms of not just in terms of they're symbolic of larger struggles that we all face. So I thought this would be a pretty good subject for an opera, and we're calling it Afterword, which is the final chapter in the book.
When will that be coming out again?
Well, the premiere is, I think, mid-October. The dates, I don't want to give you the wrong date, but at some point it's going to appear on the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago's website. And so that will be something, 2 acts. ICE is going to be the ensemble. We're going to have singers. There's going to be like it's an intermedia event. And I'm working with 2 wonderful artists, Catherine Sullivan, the film artist, and Sean Griffin, who's a composer and director. And the opera is also connected with a film project. There's an exhibition going up at the MCA Chicago in July of 2015 called The Freedom Principle, which is about radical black politics and the relationship between music and radical black politics. So there's going to be some interesting exhibitions there. One of them is a robotic kinetic sculpture that I worked on. It's going to be revived again. It was made in '92, and now we're reviving it again. There's going to be stuff by people like Charles Gaines, this wonderful painting by Jeff Donaldson, this sort of Africoba group, Wadsworth Jarrell, people like that. So it's good. Stan Douglas, the Canadian, Afro-Canadian film artist, is going to be a part of this. So it's going to be a major exhibition, and the opera serves as the afterword to that. The last week of the exhibition is going to have the opera.
Well, that sounds exciting. I mean, it seems like just an extension of the supportive community that it has been for all these years that they're doing. There's so many people involved with this.
Yeah, it's a Chicago kind of piece. I mean, both ICE and Dal Niente have strong roots in Chicago, and I'm a Chicago native, and I've been a member of this group for so long. Yeah, it's daunting. I mean, I've already have the first scene laid out. I can hear it in my head right now. I'm looking at an overture in the first scene, and the first scene takes place in, anybody from Chicago here? Anybody know about Oakwood Cemetery? Yes. That's where the first scene is going to be. You know who's buried there? Dinah Washington, people like that. And so it's going to be pretty, mystic, a lot of mists wandering around Oakwood Cemetery with those high walls. Because Philip Coran, who was one of the founders, his claim, when you interview people, they make all kinds of claims. And I don't care whether the claims are true or not. They make excellent theater. and even better if it's a little bit embellished. And so he's making a claim about getting the idea for the ASM while wandering around Oakwood Cemetery and meeting, just by chance, the other 3 founders of the organization. Now, what would 4 people be doing at the same time, wandering through a cemetery in the middle of, the south side of Chicago? Well, I think that's great theater, So thank you, Phil, for that insight. I'm writing it up now.
Well, thank you so much. Why don't we take a couple of questions? We don't have too much time, but please, if you have some questions, throw them out there. Here we go. If you could just wait for the microphone, thanks.
As a fellow Chicagoan, are you going to include the Confederate statue and what it represents from the cemetery?
I don't know yet, I probably should have a visit to the cemetery before I write this. I mean, I should go there for myself.
Walls, yeah.
But I'm not going to really go at night. I think I'm going to skip that. I mean, I grew up in that neighborhood, so I know what you can do and what you can't do.
Years, yeah.
Oh yeah. See, I just north of, south of there. I grew up in that
Woodlawn?
neighborhood. Well, I grew up on 63rd and the street near Woodlawn, around there. So it's right on the corner, yeah.
Right.
But they tore it all down around our family. It's all gone now. The L is gone. Even the L is gone.
Well, the local boy makes good.
Oh, I suppose. You never know. There's still time.
Another question up here, Jay?
I'd like to go back to something you said in the beginning and then smashed, but I'm going to ask anyway. Could you just go back and explain what global form is? Even though I know you don't want...
Oh, that, yeah, right,
Yeah,
global
even
form.
though you don't want us to think about form.
No, it's fine. No, people think of it. On some level, in its most, let's call it, I don't want to call it, it's oversimplification, really, is that on some level there's some overall sense of unity that characterizes an entire piece, more or less from beginning to end. And when you listen to it, when you finish listening to it, you get the sense that you have this overarching notion of what unifies the piece. And unity and coherence, those are all sort of high modernist buzzwords, the 50s and 60s. And so you find that quite a bit, people trying to account for that, advocate for it, look at musics that seem not to exhibit it as being lesser, for example, any kind of improvisation where you don't have that. You have sort of accretion of events instead. And so, those kinds of things, those are not, I'm not making a critique of global form. I'm just saying that our experience with it is that we experience interruptions as part of our daily lives. We get into the car, we turn on the radio, something plays for a little while, you got to get off. The piece is over. It might be going in the middle. He might have two more movements, the person, what's going to happen to the global form there? Well, their theory is that we already heard it, we just heard the intimations of it, and that if we could listen to the whole thing, the implications would be there. But I feel that a larger and more immediate and proximate experience is one of interruption, of fragmentation, and that gets into all kinds of areas of personal identity, collective social identity. I mean, we don't have a lot of time, so it seems to be an artifact of an era when people had a lot of time. And so we experience time really differently than the 19th century people did.
Well, I'd like to say thank you so much, George Lewis, for coming down and for writing the beautiful music that you're going to hear tonight, and also just very exciting music. You're really in for a treat, and thanks for speaking with
Thanks,
us.
David. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.